Greetings, friends of liberty. Does many amongst you know that I, the very soul of frivolity, once conducted a scientific experiment on babies, no less, and even delivered my conclusions to the Royal Society? No? Then do let me explain the beginnings of my illustrious career. A few years ago, Margaret and I had received an invitation to attend a dinner party at Lord Willoughby's residence at 15 Berkeley Square. The day arriving, we proceeded to the address, and after we'd been received, soon went upstairs to greet Elizabeth and lay eyes on her 6-month-old baby, Susanna Grace Willoughby. Now, normally, infants don't interest me overly, but Elizabeth being an old friend, I accompanied my better half as we ascended to the second-floor drawing-room. Entering it, we greeted Elizabeth, whose Irish nurse, Erin, was holding and talking to the infant Susanna. In good humour, Margaret and I approached, she in jest bowing slightly, and saying in her strong French accent, "What a little dear! How are you, Susanna?" The baby, however, who had been paying close attention to Nurse Erin, after briefly glancing at my wife, blinked her eyes, made a face, and turned away. We all laughed at this reaction. After a pause, I then also greeted Susanna, saying, "Such a welcome addition to the Willoughbys you are, my dear." But at this, the little thing turned to me and smiled, we all laughing at that as well. Such a different reaction. My wife, then joking, said again in her strong French accent, "Can it be, my dear girl, that you dislike a French accent? That would be early for the English indeed." Yet again, the baby looked at her and then scrunched her face and turned away. We all seeing this, a thought came to me. I said to my wife, "My dear, I suspect that 'tis not your French accent, per se, but instead her unfamiliarity with it." And so I asked Elizabeth, may I test this hypothesis by bringing Baron Steinmeier, whom I saw downstairs, up to greet Susanna? When Elizabeth agreed, saying, "Of course, my dear, far be it from me to stand in the way of scientific progress," I went downstairs, explained the situation to the Baron, and brought him back up. And when he made his introduction to Susanna, saying with a kindly, gentle smile, "Why, Susanna, what a pleasure to make your acquaintance," Susanna, as I had expected, since she had neither heard a German accent in her short life, also made a face and turned away. And so I told the assembled company my suspicions. Quite likely here, Susanna is reacting to the unfamiliarity of hearing these foreign accents, but being perfectly comfortable with the Irish accent of Erin and the English, since hearing it constantly from her parents and others. We all agreed that this was the most likely and logical conclusion, and a few weeks afterwards, I wrote up the 3 pages of our little experiment and sent it for submission to the Royal Society, they accepting it immediately and thanking me. Now if we turn to the issue of the likes and dislikes of infants and babies in your own 21st century throughout the entirety of the civilized and uncivilized world, we find today famous Canadian psychologist Paul Bloom and his Just Babies, The Origins of Good and Evil. This is certainly a most catchy title. Will it live up to its promise to reveal the very origins and nature of human morality? Bloom has long been interested in babies, saying, "When my sons were babies, I would stare at them and wonder what precisely stared back. They were like my dog, only more fascinating." He begins, as expected by his title, by pondering, as many others have, what kind of moral feelings babies are born with and demonstrate from about 3 months on. Bloom will argue that developmental psychology, supported by evolutionary biology and cultural anthropology, favors the view of Thomas Jefferson and Adam Smith that some aspects of morality come naturally to us. They include a moral sense, empathy and compassion, a rudimentary sense of fairness, and a rudimentary sense of justice. Showing his ever-present sense of humor, Bloom first says as a definition that someone once told me, and I'm not sure that she was joking, that morality is nothing more than rules about whom you can and can't have sex with. Although he replies that morality is sometimes about whom you're allowed to sleep with, he emphasizes that morality, of course, can encompass many different types of actions. He gives the example in Nevada of two men who entered a female restroom in a casino, one man murdering the 7-year-old girl he found there, but the other leaving the restroom before anything had happened, even though he suspected his companion's intentions. Although the first was charged with murder and the second escaped any legal punishment, surely the actions of both men were immoral, one involving a severe rights violation and the other the callous disregard of human life by failing at least to try to prevent the murder. More difficult to analyze, moral examples involve bestiality without causing the animal any pain, breaking a promise to a dead person, defacing the national flag, sexual contact with a sleeping child but the child is unharmed and never learns about it, incest between consenting adult siblings, and consensual cannibalism. One of the inherent problems is that cultures differ both geographically and historically, this illustrated by the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who made the observation that everyone without exception believes his own native customs to be the best. An example Herodotus used being how the Indians of the time, in order to honor their dead, ate their parents' dead bodies, while the Greeks instead burned them. But both groups, when asked about the actions of the other, were horrified. How should we understand these cultural differences? Was one nation right and the other wrong? Or were they both arbitrary, having different ways of honoring their deceased? Now, if we return to babies, how could we even discover what they thought? By utilizing one of the greatest breakthroughs in infant psychological research ever discovered, eye tracking. As Bloom says, in the 1980s, psychologists began making use of one of the few behaviors that young babies can control, the movement of their eyes. These really are windows into the baby's soul. If babies become bored by something, they look away. If they don't understand something or are surprised, they look longer. And what has some of this research shown? With regard to objects, for example, it suggests that contrary to what legions of psychology undergraduates were taught for decades, babies think of objects largely as adults do, as connected masses that move as units that are solid and subject to gravity and that move in continuous paths through space and time. This, in many ways, disqualifies the previously accepted work of Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget. Additional discoveries are that babies can anticipate a person's behavior based on their false belief. B, they appreciate and respond positively to the helping and hindering behaviors of others. C, they have the ability to feel empathy and compassion for others, although they act on these feelings less than adults. And D, they think it is fair if hard workers are rewarded more than slackers. And this brings us to one of the favorite and more tested topics among moral psychologists, whether and how egalitarian, and depending on how your ethics moral, modern babies and people are. What the various tests and games run often show is that, A, in these games, younger children for some reason tend to be much less generous to strangers than older children and adults. B, that sometimes children would choose that no one gets anything rather than they get one apple and the other person 2 apples. C, that free riding in these games, as it is in societies, is generally controlled by punishing the free riders. And D, that one of the customary ways of children to deal with free riders is by tattling. Let's turn now to other aspects of morality as they may apply to children, specifically that of ethnicity and tribalness. Bloom quotes civilizational theorist Jared Diamond, who has observed that in the small-scale societies of Papua New Guinea, to venture out of one's territory to meet other humans, even if they lived only a few miles away, was equivalent to suicide. So how do babies react to strangers? In a word, in the way that I demonstrated in my first publication for the Royal Society in 1793, they simply don't like the unfamiliar, whether it's accents or anything else. As Bloom says, newborn babies prefer to look at their mother's face rather than at a stranger's face. They prefer their mother's smell, and they prefer her voice. This preference is exhibited as early as 3 days old. Similarly, babies who are raised by a woman look longer at women. Those raised by a man look longer at men. Caucasian babies prefer to look at Caucasian faces as opposed to African or Chinese faces. Ethiopian babies prefer to look at Ethiopian faces rather than Caucasian faces. Not surprisingly, young babies can recognize the language that they have been exposed to, and they prefer it to other languages. And not only that, but they prefer that language right from birth, having heard it in the womb. Fortunately, the lessons that so many racists like Robin DiAngelo and Ibram Kendi draw, that a preference for skin color indicates racism from childhood, doesn't necessarily apply because, as Bloom points out, a specific skin color is simply something that babies and children are used to. Let's now turn to the emotion of disgust. Regarding disgust, Bloom is inalterably opposed to it, saying, disgust is a powerful force for evil. It is the opposite of empathy. If you want to exterminate or marginalize a group, this is the emotion to elicit. He argues, giving numerous examples, how anti-Semitism was intensified or expressed for centuries in Europe by viewing the Jews as dirty, unclean, and disgusting. For example, Voltaire said of the Jews, these people were so negligent of cleanliness and the decencies of life that their legislators were obliged to make a law to compel them even to wash their hands. Some evolutionary biologists claim that disgust is a beneficial part of human nature because it helps us stay away from rotten food or dangerous or infectious items like excrement or pus. What elicits disgust specifically? Bloom says blood, gore, vomit, feces, urine, and rotten flesh. Babies, though, aren't disgusted by anything. So if disgust, as Bloom argues, is bad, then in this sense, babies are very, very good. I must confess, incidentally, in feeling a kindred spirit to babies since I'm not disgusted by much. Sadly, as Bloom points out, sometime in the early childhood, a switch is thrown and children become like adults, disgusted by much of the world. With regard to incest, Bloom says that sibling incest is rare simply because most siblings don't want to have sex with one another. The very idea is disgusting. Importantly, siblings who grow up together are less likely to engage in incest, which makes perfect sense if we regard being a sibling as a psychological and not genetic relationship. This too would also suggest the interesting possibility that if a brother and sister have no clue they're related and have sex, psychologically and ethically, this is not immoral. Bloom, in due course, brings up many additional topics, a few of which are A, the trolley problem, made famous by moral philosophers and researched extensively by moral psychologists, in which if you don't act, a trolley will run over 4 people, killing them, but if you throw a track switch, it will run over only one person, killing him. Most people don't throw the switch, apparently because being active instead of passive here feels wrong. B, a related problem arises if we could shove a person to his death, thereby saving many others, or instead use a trapdoor to do it, in which case we wouldn't have to touch him. Most people would not shove the person, even to save many others, but would release the trapdoor. Bloom and others argue that this shows a kind of innate visceral disgust against touching people while killing them. C, The psychologist Stanley Milgram is famous for his experiment with Yale students and others in which he showed them willing to comply in subjecting innocent test subjects to increasingly severe electric shocks, just because they were told to. But what most people don't know is that Milgram also ran another experiment in which he simply dropped letters to be mailed around New Haven, which were addressed and had a stamp, he finding that the vast majority of the letters arrived at their destination. This shows the willingness of many strangers to do simple good deeds for others. D. Bloom notes interestingly how psychopaths are markedly insensitive to the expression fear. Normal people recognize fear and treat it as a distress cue, but psychopaths have problems seeing it, let alone responding to it appropriately. E. He ends, appropriately enough, by praising the profound ability of reason to help us shape our moral responses to the world, but notes how the fall of reason is particularly dramatic in the study of moral psychology. This is in large part due to the work of the psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who argues that moral reasoning does not cause moral judgment. Rather, moral reasoning is usually generated after a judgment has been reached. Bloom argues instead that many moral intuitions can be justified. People are not tongue-tied when asked why drunk driving is wrong or why it is a good thing to hold a door open for someone on crutches. And moral intuitions change over time. So when, for example, 200 years ago, not many people believed in the value of interracial marriages, now hardly anyone objects. What happened to all those rationalizations and post hoc excuses? Jonathan Haidt. Vanquished over time by reason. Let's now turn to evaluation. I love this book. Bloom has a magnificent ability to teach and demonstrates it by leading us through the research literature, explaining it and its meaning in great detail and simplicity while giving many historical examples and constantly utilizing his brilliant sense of humor. I would give this an A, and I'm tempted to give it an A+. But the reason I don't give it an A+ is because there are still, despite his great strengths, some weaknesses. Let's examine these. Number one, most moral psychologists, being liberals, praise the virtues, kindness, and generosity as they should, but never mention the virtues of creativity and productivity. And Bloom, too, no mention. Instead, he starts the book by giving the example of journalist and author Virginia Postrel donating one of her kidneys to doctor and researcher Sally Satel. Or he says, talking about encountering a beggar on the street, if you were cold-blooded, you would walk by and do nothing. If you were generous, you would walk by and hand over some money. To see how morally mistaken this focus is, let's imagine Steve Jobs and Bill Gates being complete jerks, which may not have been and be too far from the truth. And let's compare them to your average generous, kind, soup kitchen social worker. Our jerks, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, helped literally billions of people by creating smartphones and operating systems, while the guy doling out the soup helps thousands in his kindness. Which is more moral, or at least does more good in the world? Jobs and Gates. But you'll never see the morality of creativity and productivity, to my knowledge, investigated or praised by these morals philosophers. It's irrelevant to them. Number two, on the issue of free riding, Bloom again uses the popular term of selfishness, saying, I want a world where people pay taxes, but the world I would most prefer from a selfish standpoint is the one where everyone pays taxes but me. But to use what you don't pay for isn't actually selfish any more than going into a grocery store and successfully shoplifting is selfish compared to paying for what you use. To the contrary, to cooperate with everyone in creating an honest, well-functioning society is both selfish and principled. Number three, he at times overreaches, showing his lack of exposure to economics when he says, for example, it would be absurd to explain the gross disparities between whites and blacks in America, for instance, without reference to the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. Clearly, he hasn't read Charles Murray's Losing Ground or Thomas Sowell's Visions of the Anointed and Social Justice Fallacies, which all show the enormous destructiveness of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs for the black community. Neither has he read other books showing how badly affirmative action, minimum wage laws, and the drug war have damaged it. Number four, It's not clear that he understands the value of stereotypes. He says, a T-shirt printed by the satirical magazine The Onion says, stereotypes are a real time saver. But there are instances where it's just wrong to treat an individual on the basis of the group he or she belongs to. It's better to take the extra time. Most people understand that, but if you're walking down the rundown street of a dangerous inner-city neighborhood and see a tough-looking brother coming the other way, it just might be prudent to head to the other side of the street. Stereotypes can be useful when used as generalizations. Number 5, at one point he says, parents are being reasonable when they try to extinguish racism in their children by putting them in racially diverse schools. I disagree. Race is utterly irrelevant among classmates. Number 6, on the origins of disgust, he says, for example, it's not the child discovers that adults don't play with feces, as if this were some arbitrary cultural practice. Rather, children come to find feces gross. This statement is certainly false at times, since there are many things that children and people come to find gross that aren't. So he doesn't explain why Orthodox Jews and Muslims come to find spare ribs and garlic sauce, one of the most delicious meals in existence, disgusting, or he doesn't explain why American children find fried grasshoppers disgusting, while Mexican, Thai, and Nigerian don't. And so when he says, nobody ever told me that it is gross to eat fried rat, I find it gross because during the critical period of childhood, people around me never ate it. I would answer here by saying that a farm-grown, healthy, disease-free rat I would eat just as easily as I would eat chicken, pork, or beef. And so that's a wrap. Despite these final criticisms, I love this book. Happy for my part to have finally begun my scientific career at the Royal Society, and proud to have published the first paper ever on the reaction of children to foreign accents. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.